In 1861, our nation was on the brink of an imminent crisis. By April of that year, a great civil war had broken out, North against South, brother against brother. After 2 long years of fighting, the war moved into the Northern Territory. The fate of the nation hung in the balance as one of the most critical battles of the American Civil War was about to be fought. Confederate General Lee began his move north on June 5, 1863, after defeating Union forces at Winchester, Virginia. Lee believed that a victory on Northern soil would advance a growing Northern desire for peace and secure recognition of the Confederacy by Europe. General Hooker followed Lee out of Virginia, and by June 26th, Confederate troops under the leadership of General Early were in Gettysburg on their way to York. Seeking supplies, most of the Confederate soldiers honored Lee's orders to respect the people and personal property of Northern civilians, though payment with Confederate money was of little use to the shopkeepers. The troops departed from Gettysburg for York the next day. Little did the town know what the future held. Just 1 day after Early's troops made it to Gettysburg, General Hooker resigned his command and was replaced by General George Meade as commander of the Army of the Potomac. With very little information on Lee's whereabouts and the intentions of the Confederate Army, Meade took his army north to Pennsylvania. On June 30th, Confederates again marched to Gettysburg in search of supplies, this time from their camps in Cashtown. Upon reaching the edge of Gettysburg, the Southern troops learned of Union cavalry and returned to report their findings to Lieutenant General A.P. Hill. Hill planned to send troops to investigate the following day, July 1st, 1863. A small town of only 2,400, Gettysburg welcomed the Union soldiers as they marched into town on June 30th. Neither the townspeople nor the soldiers knew what the 1st of July would bring. July 1st, 1863. It was the early morning of July 1st when the Confederate troops under General Henry Heath marched east from Cashtown and first met with Union troops. Reinforcements arrived about 10 a.m. along McPherson's Ridge. The Battle of Gettysburg had begun. Union infantry was able to force the Southern troops back. Confederate troops fought, but many were forced to surrender along Willoughby's Run and in the railroad cut just to the north of the Chambersburg Pike. During this attack, Major General John Reynolds, commander of the Union First Corps, became the first general to fall at the Battle of Gettysburg. By noon, fighting had slowed, giving both Union and Confederate a chance to review their position and make new plans. The Union found themselves extended from the McPherson Farm north along Seminary and Oak Ridges. The 11th Army Corps, fresh upon arrival, was deployed north of Gettysburg. By 2 p.m., the Confederate troops were on the attack against the Union line on McPherson's and Oak Ridge. When General Lee arrived, finding a battle initiated, he took the opportunity to attack the Union on their own soil. Lee knew he would have troops on 3 sides of the Union once General Ewell's Corps arrived from the east. General Doubleday, who replaced Reynolds commanding the First Corps, realized after 2 hours of fighting that the ridges west of Gettysburg could not be held and ordered to withdraw to Seminary Ridge. North of town, Ewell's Confederates had arrived, and the 11th Corps of the Union knew they too were losing too many men. As the Union lines collapsed, Northern troops pushed through the streets, yards, and alleys of Gettysburg, seeking shelter in outbuildings, churches, and structures already filled with wounded and dying. The citizens of Gettysburg hid in their cellars, or braved the fight and cared for the wounded. Retreating soldiers made their way to Cemetery Hill on the far side of Gettysburg, where General Hancock reorganized the troops into a line of defense from Cemetery Ridge to Culp's Hill. As night fell, the battle slowed, and soldiers, exhausted from a day of unexpected and fierce fighting, collapsed where they had stood, only to fight another day. Though Lee took day 1, Meade's troops had secured the strong position south of town when he arrived near midnight. His plan was to concentrate troops around Cemetery Hill and await Lee's attack. On the other side of Gettysburg, along Seminary Ridge, Lee waited, contemplating the Union defense and the growing numbers Meade was assembling. Soldiers awoke to fog on the morning of July 2nd, a day that would become the bloodiest of the Battle of Gettysburg. The Union Army, with strong positions along a giant U-shaped line from Culp's Hill to Cemetery Ridge, held under Meade's order in anticipation of the remainder of the Army of the Potomac's arrival. In Lee's review of the Union position, he believed he could present a simultaneous attack on the left and right flank of the Union line. General Hill was ordered to hold the Confederate center, while General Longstreet received orders from Lee to take the Union left. Ewell's corps took the Union right. After a long march, Longstreet's men had reached the southern tip of Seminary Ridge at 3:30 p.m. With a few moments of rest, the Southern soldiers were called to attack the Union left. Meade was unaware that as the Confederates moved, so did Major General Sickles, leaving Meade's line vulnerable. Confederate cannons opened fire on Sickles' line from Devil's Den to the Peach Orchard. Confederate General Hood attacked as fighting took place at Devil's Den, the wheat field, at the Peach Orchard, and on the slopes of Little Round Top. Sickles would be wounded during the fighting. The fighting in the wheat field alone would result in over 6,000 officers and men of both sides killed, wounded, or captured. Over 2 hours after the attack began, General McLaws sent Brigadier General Barksdale and his Mississippi Brigade to attack the Union near the Peach Orchard, with support coming from troops along the Seminary Ridge. The Union line collapsed and pushed back across the Trossel Farm. But before the Confederate attack could be successful, Union forces counterattacked, pushing the Southern troops back. At 4 p.m., to coincide with Longstreet's attack, General Ewell opened his cannonade on the Union right. But the Union artillery were waiting. When General Johnson's Confederate infantry finally reached Rock Creek to attack Culp's Hill, a single Union brigade under Brigadier General Greene was there to halt the attack. Just northwest of Culp's Hill, General Early ordered the Louisiana Tigers and North Carolina soldiers up Cemetery Hill, where they were met by Union reinforcements and thrown off. For good. As darkness fell on the second day of the battle, Meade brought forth fresh troops and by 10 p.m. had re-established his line from Cemetery Ridge to Big Round Top. It appeared to Lee as he sat in his headquarters on the Chambersburg Road that the Confederate attack had failed. On the other side of the battlefield, General Meade gathered his generals in his headquarters on the Taneytown Road, where they planned the climax of the Gettysburg campaign that had started nearly a month earlier in Virginia. July 3, 1863, the final day. The next morning, the Union 12th Army Corps was waiting when General Johnson returned the attack. Fierce fighting took place from the summit of the hill to Spangler's Spring for 6 hours. The Confederate attack of Culp's Hill had ended at approximately 11 a.m. The Union fishhook line was intact. Lee decided to alter his attack, and under the command of General Longstreet, went for the center of the Union line. Over 150 Confederate guns opened on Seminary Ridge at 1 p.m. The attack brought the Union artillery to life. The bombardment continued for nearly 2 hours before the Union slowed. As the Union guns began to silence, Longstreet gave orders, and nearly 12,000 Confederate soldiers marched out from the tree line toward the Union line roughly a mile away. It was at that moment that the Union artillery came back to life. As the Confederate forces that remained made it to the Emmitsburg Road, the Union muskets opened fire. The Southern soldiers marched on to the angle, led by Brigadier General Lewis Armistead of Pickett's division. He and his men broke through the center of the Union line, crossing over the stone wall with just 300 men. It was the high water mark of the battle, of the war for the Confederacy. North of this point on the battlefield, additional troops under Confederate Generals Pettigrew and Trimble also reached the Union lines, met by fierce Union resistance. The Confederates were repelled. Pickett's charge had failed. The few Southern soldiers left turned back to Seminary Ridge. Just as the fighting ended, General Meade entered the scene. His men were victorious. The Union had beaten Robert E. Lee. Pickett's charge had failed. On this same day, Jeb Stuart had also been defeated by Brigadier General George Armstrong Custer at what is known today as East Cavalry Field. Lee determined it was time to retreat back to Virginia. As the Confederate forces fell, so too did the night. It was time for the land to heal. But it would be nearly 2 more years before the war would end, and many more before our great nation could heal. As the Confederate forces made their way through Cashtown and Fairfield back into Maryland, skirmishes continued. But in Gettysburg, a different type of war was now being fought. Over 7,000 soldiers were killed during the 3-day battle, and approximately 22,000 wounded soldiers from both sides were left behind to be cared for by citizens and surgeons. The U.S. Army Medical Department sent personnel with equipment and supplies. Camp Letterman was established off the York Pike, known today as Route 30. Both Union and Confederate were treated at the camp, brought there from remote locations. Once the soldiers were strong enough, they were sent on to permanent hospitals in Baltimore or Philadelphia. Approximately 4,000 more soldiers would pass, either at Camp Letterman or in the hospitals where they had been sent. The wounded being cared for, it was time to find a proper burial place for the Union soldiers who gave their all. In the fall of 1863, through state funding, the Soldiers' National Cemetery was established under the direction of attorney David Wills. On November 18, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln arrived in Gettysburg. The following day, Lincoln would help dedicate the cemetery with keynote speaker Edward Everett. During Lincoln's brief speech on November 19th, known throughout the world as the Gettysburg Address, our 16th president lit a spark of hope in the Northern movement and began the long journey down the path of reunification. Gettysburg was a turning point for both the Northern and Southern armies and our nation.
407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, brother, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.